Victoria, and welcome to Bill Mackay. Can you hear me, Bill?
Can you? I can hear you, Catherine.
Here we are. We're linked. We're holding hands across some kind of internet platform. Bill is Senior Lecturer in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Auckland, and today you're having a nosy around our own backyards.
Yes. So last time you gave me a little task. You mentioned that a Wellington City Council employee in a local government TED Talk kind of thing told an audience that Wellingtonians don't realise, quote, but the solution to their housing problem is in their backyard. Well, her name was Erica Richards, and she got us both thinking. So in two parts, I'm going to look at accommodation in backyards. So on a Saturday, I can wake up, I can look at a range of well-built, building code compliant cabins online. I can find out if they can be dropped in my backyard or, fully assembled, or if it's a little bit tight, assembled in my backyard, and I can buy one. That's all in the morning. I can get it delivered, assembled in a couple of weeks. So basically the building isn't a problem. I'm also told by the manufacturer, and this is true, I don't need a building consent for it if it's under 30 square metres, and that's a recent government loosening up from 10 square metres. Sleep outs are okay as well, but actually everything's more complicated than that, and that's what Erica Richards was talking about. So I'll just run through the complications. They say no consent is required, but they're talking about building consent. And a lot of people don't realise there is a split between planning permission or resource consent and building consent. Building consent's a national thing, but every council's got different zones and rules for what you can do in your backyard. If it's bigger than 30 square metres or I want plumbing in my cabin, then I will need a building consent. And to do that, if it's going to be a habitable space, I need a licensed building practitioner or a registered architect or someone to lodge the building consent for me. So I've got to pay consultants. If I need resource consent, then I need to pay a consultant to prepare that for me. And council fees for everything. And also, I've got to bear in mind connections to services, electricity, definitely, maybe water, drainage, got to do something with the rainwater, and maybe sewage. And maybe there's a deck or some paving, and they need consents too in certain circumstances. So if I want my cabin as a self-contained dwelling, that's also another planning permission, plus consents and costs for sewage, definitely this time. So it all starts to get quite complicated quite fast, unless we're just doing a little shed or simple sleep out. We also need to think about how we retain amenity to everyone who's living there, plus the neighbours as well. So next time, I'll talk about a system prompted by Erica Richards' ideas for some sort of template that can fast-track things in your comments on cutting the red tape. But just now, I'll do a bit of a context and brief history of backyards and cross-leasing. So basically, Victorian Edwardian period, up until the Second World War, backyards are pretty utilitarian. Stringing up the washing line, big veggie gardens, citrus trees, maybe a couple of fruit trees, all of that sort of thing. If we fast forward to post-war, then we start to see the backyard becoming much more of a kind of a lifestyle, suburban backyard paradise kind of thing. Decks, patios, barbecues, even swimming pools. Landscaping, exotic planting, gradually displacing veggie gardens, more of a focus on children with play sets and things like that. These days, trees are an endangered species. There used to be a national general protection on them, but that went with the last national government when they first came in. And today, the backyard is an oasis, really. The folding clothesline is hidden away, the wheelie bin, the recycling, it's all tucked away. The increasing problem, I think, for the immaculately curated backyards of the middle class is a discreet place for the cat or the dog to go to the toilet. So in terms of living in the backyard, councils used to, have what we call granny flats, officially minor dwelling units, but some councils didn't. To get around that kind of thing, we used to disguise our proposals as studios. So if you wanted a granny flat and you weren't allowed to have one, we would apply for permission to have a studio in the backyard with a sink, clean my paintbrushes, that sort of thing. And what's a kitchen? A kitchen is really just a fridge on one side, a sink, and an oven on the other side. It's pretty easy to kind of put in an illegal shower. The tricky thing's a toilet if you're turning your studio into a granny flat. And we also had to sign a letter swearing to the council that it wasn't for living in, but no one ever comes and checks up on that sort of thing. And then into the 1980s, after the kind of economic ructions of the 70s and the 1980s, urban growth, accommodation pinches, we saw the development of cross-leasing, and this has been, until recently, the big way that people have built a building in their backyards by selling off the backyard. And we saw a whole spate in the suburbs, particularly in Auckland, of people flogging their backyard and new two-storey houses generally popping up in there. The cross-lease really boomed in the late 80s and 90s, and subdivision involves a minimum site size and it can be expensive. And cross-leasing was kind of a cheaper way of getting around the rules, and that allowed smaller sections to be split up. And you didn't have to pay a development contribution to the council. So it was cheap and it was a bit of a loophole. In a subdivision, you own the whole land, but in the cross-lease, both parties own all the site, but each has rights over their bit, and you might be sharing a driveway. It's also comparatively cheap to lift a timber-floored house and move it forward on a section to create space for a cross-lease in the second dwelling at the back, and we've seen lots of that. But cross-leases are definitely less popular today, and council fees have kind of made it more expensive to do. Also, people are finding it can be messy because you're sharing your site coverage and other planning rules with both parties. You might need the other party's permission to do anything, and resale tends to be less than if it were cleanly subdivided. So that's a little brief history of backyards and how we've been trying to exploit them for dwellings. And we know there's this big demand for cabins out there. They're really booming. Tiny houses have been attempting to exploit loopholes and create minor dwelling units in backyards. So there's a real desire there, but of course, how do we empower people to help themselves and maintain the amenity for themselves, whoever's living in the smaller place at the back, and the neighbours? So Erica Richards has got a few ideas on that. I've been developing a cunning plan as well. So next time when I follow up on this, I'll be talking you through how we can cut the red tape but ensure quality.
That's wonderful. I think from memory she'd been proposing a portal because part of it also is just trying to get some consistency, and we know there's a lot of differences often between councils, but also just not meaning that you spend so much on legal and planning fees that the whole motivation to try and do something is lost before you start.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'll mention as well that makes this increasingly important is we use the term granny flat, but these days family structures are so different. Split families, blended families, kids coming back home once they get pregnant, that sort of thing. So, it's not the days of the first Labor government state houses, mum, dad and 2 kids.
Well, it's kids saving sometimes to try and buy their own place and not wanting to pay sky-high rents. That's another possibility. Or just leasing it out for some extra income, which might be an added complication as well. But we don't want to put barriers in the way of people making room of the space they have, whether it's a room in their house or something that could be a partitioning of their house, or indeed putting something livable in the backyard. We don't want to make it more difficult than it needs to be. I'll really look forward to next time to your plan. Thank you, sir. Bill Mackay of the University of Auckland School of Architecture and Planning wraps up 9 to noon.